on his electoral platform and selling himself to 100 million people to be their next president. He cast himself as an insurgent outsider. None of this sort of these oligarchies that you've had for all these years in Manila, this imperial Manila. No, I'm going to get rid of them. New broom. I talk the language of the poor, and he made really bad jokes about things like rape, and he spoke salty language, and a lot of people laughed, and they thought, this guy's great. He's brilliant. He's really funny, and he really knows what he's talking about, because he put this city in order, and they believed him, and so did the outside world at first, and the reason we should care about him is not just because since he came to power so many people have been killed, but because this guy represents in microcosm, in a nutshell, what the very worst of authoritarian populism in our world today is like. He's a violent man. He's a misogynist par excellence. He's a narcissist, and he has sanctioned mass murder across the Philippines. You know, I nearly brought a prop with me today, which is even sicker than this book, and it's a book I was given by a friend of mine with whom I made a documentary in Northern Ireland, which is where I'm from. And I was hoiked out of Northern Ireland as a child, and I didn't really know it that well. So I was delighted to have the chance to go and work there and make a documentary. And at the end of this time, I was given a present, a book, and the book was called Lost Lives, and it was by a well-known journalist. You'll know his name, David McKittrick, and three other journalists who'd worked with him on this immense tome, which had taken them years to build. And what it was a portrait of all the people who'd been killed in the Northern Ireland conflict over 30 years. And it was really moving. And he wrote, and I wrote this down this morning because I was looking at it, in the front there's a dedication to our children, that they might learn from the lessons of the past. In those 30 years in Northern Ireland, 3,600 people died. In 18 months in the Philippines, under Rodrigo Duterte, 3 times that number died. And there were no loving tributes or books written about who they were. And it's very, very moving. They've got incredible stories, and I tell some of those stories in this book, but this is the reason why we should care, because it's undocumented, it's extreme, and it's really, really violent.
I mean, in terms of how you've gone about doing this, I mean, you say in the book that you don't like parachuted in, Western colonial journalists, and you've obviously spent a lot of time in the country. How did you go about finding these stories and telling them and making sure that you got it right?
Well, it was helped in large part by the fact that I'd been deployed by Channel 4 News to the Philippines to report about this guy as he emerged. And yes, I mean, Filipinos hate it when white Western journalists rock up in their country and pontificate sagely about what they think is going on. Anybody does anywhere. And as a foreign correspondent, you have to be really sensitive to this sort of thing. And this book, it's not my voice really. All I'm doing is sort of putting together an anthology of other people's voices, and I did probably around 40 interviews with people. Some of them were the critics of Duterte. Some of them were the victims of Duterte. Others were Duterte's own family, two of his sisters, school friends, cabinet ministers, people from all walks of life who knew something about Duterte and had something to offer. And so I wanted to put together an account of this man which struck a chord with Filipinos. And so apart from the reporting that I'd already done over in the Philippines, I spent just over 2 months just working flat out doing interviews, mostly basing myself between Manila and Davao City in the south, where he'd been the mayor for a couple of decades. But this book are the voices of those people, and anybody who gets to the end of it will find in the acknowledgements a tribute to those who helped me, but whose names I cannot mention, because to do so would be to vastly diminish their life expectancies. they cannot be named because they would probably be killed. And that's the atmosphere of this republic of fear that Duterte has created there.
What about you? Can you go back?
Well, I've been discussing this afternoon with my foreign editor. It's a little bit of an issue. I mean, to be based in a region where, this is one of the big stories, it's, you can't leave a place uncovered. And there are, of course, ways of covering a story which doesn't necessarily entail you're having to go there and risk your neck. It's hard to know.
I mean, you described him in great detail as sort of a mass murderer, a philanderer, Moorish man.
Yeah. But he likes that. And I mean, truth be told, he's a narcissist. And narcissists love this stuff. I mean, he likes to be cast as Duterte Harry. He actually likes it. So there's part of me that sort of wonders whether he mightn't just kind of quite like it. Now, whether that is going to keep me any safer, I don't know. And also, there is a thing in journalism where if you are putting yourself, your reputation and your life sometimes on the line, telling these stories about human rights abuse, about repression, by exposing yourself in that way, you are therefore in some ways kept safer, because maybe you'd be harder to target. But there are very prominent senators in the Philippines, one of whom or two of whom are quoted in the book. There are human rights workers, prominent human rights defenders in the Philippines, who they're scared for their safety. I mean, Duterte is threatened to behead human rights workers. Actually, behead them, not to kill them. If you bear with me, I want to read you one little thing, which is about when the Philippines is a country where it's like it's almost as Catholic as the Vatican, and Duterte gets away somehow with calling the Pope the son of a whore and laying into the Catholic Church, but he had his marriage annulled. You can't get a divorce there. And when he had his marriage annulled, his wife went to get a psychiatric assessment. This is like more than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that he split up from his wife. And the psychiatrist was a very, very prominent psychiatrist who made this assessment of Duterte's personality. And it really chimes. And if I could just read that, it's just one paragraph. Here's a conclusion. He is suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder with aggressive features. And Dr. Diane cited what she characterized as his gross indifference, insensitivity and self-centeredness, his grandiose sense of self and entitlement, his manipulative behaviors, his lies and his deceits, as well as his pervasive tendency to demean, humiliate others and violate their rights and feelings. In summary, Rodrigo's personality disturbance, which constitutes his psychological incapacity, is deemed serious, incurable, and with antecedents. And the bits of that assessment, which I obtained in the time I was over in the Philippines, bits of it leaked to the local press, and people were writing stories saying, "Oh my God, if we're not careful, we'll elect a psychopath." But they did, and in fact,
have you worked out why? I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Whatever he is, he's immensely popular, or has been.
It's a really hard question to figure out. You have to take it apart. There's lots of reasons. Some people love him because he's like the poor people, even though they are mostly the victims of his drugs war. Poor people like him because he speaks their dirty language, and they think he's funny, and they think he's down and dirty, and he is, but it's a lie. This guy is actually the son of a governor. He had a really privileged upbringing, and the reason he speaks this dirty language is because he hung out with his father's bodyguards, who taught him how to swear and drink and leer at women and shoot guns. But it's poor people like that, and he seemed a man of the people. Other people felt, he played the same game as Trump played. He plays the politics of anxiety card. So when Trump sort of talks about Mexicans and says the rapists, Duterte says drug addicts, and says they're destroying your country. And the middle classes thought, yeah, there's a bit of a crime wave here, he's right. So yeah, we'll get rid of the drug addicts, we're probably going to be okay. So he chimed with various classes, and if you look across the popularity ratings in ever since, it's really weird. I mean, it goes across the social caste strata, it goes across educational strata. There's no way to really explain. And I spoke to an academic in Australia recently who's been looking into this, and she defines what she calls the politics of marginalisation. And she noticed, for example, that in a city called Tacloban, which is in eastern Luzon, the central island, which was very, very badly hit by a typhoon about 3 years ago, very, very poor people, deprived of everything, lost everything. Duterte basically voted in by just about everyone, incredibly popular. And she believes that somehow, that among the very poorest people in society, there was something about this guy and the promises that he made, even though they were cheap lies, that struck a chord and that maybe explains to some degree his popularity.
I mean, you've also spent a lot of time with the poorest people in society, talking to them about the terrible things and the killings. And so, where did the two things rub up against each other? I mean, is one neighbour a Duterte fan while another has had a child shot dead?
Well, I mean, one of the most bizarre things was that of two particular families who I spent an awful lot of time with, and these were families where they lost. In both cases it was the husband who was killed, and in both cases they were the poorest of the poor pedicab drivers, the bicycle taxi drivers, and their wives were left with their bodies and nothing else, and both of those guys had voted for Duterte. Another guy who I met, who was on the run, having been put on a death list, he voted for Duterte. It's
having liked his anti-crime message, or just liking him for other reasons.
I mean,
how important was that thing, in terms of his popularity?
Well, I mean, if he had a platform at all, it was mass murder. I mean, that's what he promised. He came in, and I don't know if you watched any of this stuff when he was in his election rallies, or even subsequently when he gives his speeches. I mean, it's just a recurring, I will kill you, shoot them in the head, shoot them in the heart, kill them, and it's just this constant refrain, and it's sort of like a death cult, and he says it in this sort of deadpan manner, and people, I don't know, when he says it to the police, for example, at a big parade in the centre of Manila on Police Commemoration Day, they all cheer and clap and think it's wonderful, and they think that he's giving them a free rein to do what they've been doing anyway. When he says it on TV, mums and dads worry about their kids hearing it, and language in playgrounds has apparently got a lot worse since Duterte came in, because all the kids mimic him. But it's again, it's one of these sort of like very contradictory signals that sent out. People vote for him because they somehow were impressed by what he promised, and yet many are have genuine abhorrence over the carnage that he's created since he came in. Inexplicable.
I mean, you've already said he's a fake in terms of his upbringing. What have you ended up feeling that he is ultimately about? Is he just a narcissist who's out for his own power and ego, or does he have a grand plan that is sincere in any way? Does he want the best for his country?
Well, look, I've tried in the finest Channel 4 News journalistic traditions to be even-handed and fair in this assessment of Duterte, because, truth be told, there are some things that he's done which are quite progressive, and you think, really? Did he really introduce the most progressive laws about women's rights in all of the Philippines, like 10 years or more ahead of his time? Did he really set up a drugs rehabilitation centre in Davao City? Seriously? And did he do all these things in the city to keep people safe and to I mean, it was like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who stopped smoking in public and all this sort of thing, was aware of the dangers of cigarettes in a country where so many people smoke. And he did all this stuff, and you know, even as president, he brought into the cabinet this extraordinary range of people from all walks of life.
And one man who says he's seen Duterte killing himself. I mean, did you believe that?
Very
When
much
he
so.
described what happens.
You know, when you do what you and I do, you get a sense when you've been in Syria recently. You talk to people about their war experiences, or you talk to people about, you know, repression in regimes around the Middle East or Africa, and you very quickly get a sense of whether someone really experienced something, whether it's true. I mean, it's clear. The man who I wrote a whole chapter on in this book goes by the wonderful name of Matabato. Matabato was a hard killer, and for, I don't know, 15, 20 years nearly, that's what he did for Duterte. And what Duterte managed to do is he subverted the police force in Davao City. And there was a unit within the police force called the Heinous Crimes Unit. And it was the Heinous Crimes Unit that became the core of his death squad, which over the course of the 20 years or so killed more than 1,400 people, many of them street kids. And Matabato was part and parcel of that. He described to me not only individual killings, how he'd done it, who they were. In fact, sometimes he didn't know who they were because Duterte and his cohorts didn't tell the killers the true identities of the people they were murdering. I have no doubt what he did. Absolutely no doubt that he was speaking the truth. He was rubbished when he gave testimony in Congress, laughed out of town, and Duterte, and the Malacanang Palace basically dismissed him as a fraud. But I think his testimony, and he's offered to give this ultimately one day in The Hague, when perhaps Rodrigo Duterte will be in the dock. I mean, this is a guy who's 72 years old now. The ICC has, the wheels of justice turn very slowly. We've watched this with various other people who've been hauled up in front of the ICC or various other Hague tribunals over the years. It happens slowly. He's 72 years old. He might evade justice, and he's behaving like someone who thinks he will, because he's so blatant. His incitements to kill are just in your face. The prosecutors who have looked at other mad autocrats over the years, whether it's Bashar al-Assad or Slobodan Milosevic or Karadzic or whoever, they pour for months, years sometimes, through piles of documents to try to see if they can find evidence of that crucial command responsibility. The thing that would link that leader to the actual killings in the field. And with people like Mladic and Karadzic and what happened in Srebrenica, it was finally established and they were convicted. But it took years to actually, because they're careful, these people. They know how to conceal things. But this guy is a lawyer. And he knows how, when he claims to have killed people, he sort of never gives quite enough detail to make himself individually prosecutable. But what he has said to ordinary Filipinos in his urging them to go out and kill drug addicts. Even on day one, he went down to a slum called Tondo and said to mums and dads, kill the drug addicts. And if your own kid's a drug addict, and I know it must be really hard to kill your own kids, so get someone else to kill them for you. He actually said this on the first day in office. He'd just been sworn in. It's incredible. So these are things which one day could lead to his prosecution. These guys, excuse me, these guys who I interviewed in the book, who had witnessed him killing and who claimed to have killed for him, were in absolutely no doubt that he was the mastermind and he was the godfather of the Davao death squad.
And having spoken to them, why were they doing it? I mean, is life cheaper there? To them?
I mean, it is, yes. I mean, it is astonishing to go to a country where, something between 12 and 20,000 people have been killed in 2 years. And the cemeteries are filling up, the funeral parlours are full, just as Duterte said they would be. the fish in Manila Bay are growing fat on the corpses of those he would throw in there. That's what he claimed in the run up to the election. And guess what? There are corpses floating in Manila Bay with heads wrapped in masking tape, killed in this drugs war. It seems like an unstoppable thing, which is happening now. And although it goes in sort of in waves, and you get periods of more killing, it's been incessant. I can't remember what the question was.
Why the guys in the death squads doing
Oh right, why are they doing
because
it?
they will also be seeing
Yeah.
the children who you describe in the book being shot by accident, all the collateral damage and the misery.
Look, I mean,
why they come from those
okay,
same
but one thing, that they're paid. And another thing is they're scared. So in the book, I talk about at one point I got my hands on what I call the dirty dossier. It was just after, remember that dirty dossier that was put about by Christopher Steele, the former MI6 guy who'd come up with all that dirt on Trump. I wondered if there might be such a thing in the Philippines about Duterte, and it didn't take long to get one. But this wasn't sort of like golden showers in Moscow hotel rooms. It wasn't that sort of stuff. This was the mechanics of the drugs war, and it was an incredible read. It was who did what and how they did it and how they got paid for it. And you know, there is a payment structure, so that the person who pulls the trigger on these hits gets half the takings of the kill, and the kill payments are graded according to sort of like low life, drug addicts, dealers, and then as it goes up the tree, more and more and more. So you get by the time you get to sort of village mayors or this sort of thing, you know, you're talking 100,000 pesos, and so 50,000 pesos for the kill man is quite good money. So there is money in it, but also I know that they are drafted in. They don't have any choice. These policemen are being told, you will go and do this, you will go and do that, you're in this team, you're going out tonight, this is the target. That's how it works. And so I talked to a priest who was taking confessions from people who were killers. One of them, he said, was a former altar boy who he knew, and he said, I had no choice. I had to do it. And they're living with this. So it's not like the killers themselves are. I mean, I actually felt quite sorry for them, because they don't have a choice in this, and such as the repression of this police state, this Gestapo-like state which Duterte has created, that the killers themselves are unable to help themselves and to refuse the orders.
I mean, you mentioned Trump. I mean, have you got any thoughts on how similar the two men are?
I do. They absolutely love each other. I mean, when Trump first mentioned the Philippines, it was in a very derogatory context. I can't remember, he called them like a terrorist nation or something. And this was quite early on, and Duterte would sort of jump to it and promised Trump a boxing match in Las Vegas if he didn't retract, and if he didn't want to go to Las Vegas, he'd come to the Philippines and he'd take him out. But actually, after a while, it became clear that these two were kindred spirits, and it didn't take long in office before Trump said, Rodrigo, I just want to congratulate you on the terrific job you're doing in your war on drugs. And it was the Philippines that leaked this, the transcript of the conversation, the Philippine Foreign Ministry, and the White House confirmed it. It was actually said. And then Trump ultimately ended up in Manila at this big ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Regional Association meeting in Manila, and they had this big love-in, and actually they toasted each other, and Duterte crooned a ballad saying "I love you." But look, there's another little thing I just want to read to you. There's an American. You'll know this guy. He's one of my favourite writers, and he's in the New York Times. He's called David Blow, and he did lots of. Charles Blow, and he did lots of sort of reading into Trump. I don't know where to start because it's also good. This is his analysis of Trump, which when I read it, I thought, that rings a bell. He says, apart from their insurgent populism, this is me writing, apart from insurgent populism, Manglish, which is what I call Duterte's mangled English and Tagalog and everything else, is another thing that Duterte has in common with Donald Trump. Writing in the New York Times, columnist Charles M. Blow noted that Trumpian language is a thing unto itself, a jumble of incomplete thoughts stitched together with arrogance and ignorance. America is suffering under a tyranny of gibberish. He referred to Trump's style of rhetorics as parataxis, consisting of short, sharp sentences used to emphasize certainty and determination, a hallmark of dictators. I was immediately reminded of Duterte's campaign style, populist soundbite rhetoric. Kill them! These sons of whores are destroying our country. I will kill you. And it goes on about, I talk about the half-truths and alt-facts and oft-repeated assertions that the Philippines is in the throes of a pandemic of drugs that's so serious that national security is threatened. And then Blow says this, many people will expect a political lie to sound slick, to be delivered by intellectual elites spouting $5 words. A clumsy, folksy lie is delivered by a shyster using broken English, and that reads as truth. Read together, the transcripts, and he's talking about Trump, paint a terrifying portrait of a man who is simultaneously unintelligible in his delivery, self-assured in his ignorance, and consciously bathing in his narcissism. And that is what Duterte Harry and Donald Trump have in common. They have absolutely no idea what they're talking about sometimes, but they'll say it with such certainty that people somehow believe them.
And is he getting away with political lies?
Yeah. I mean, on many levels. I mean, okay, so political lie number one was foisting the belief on the Filipino people that this city called Davao had been cured of all its ills. That there was no more drug addiction. It used to be the murder capital of the Philippines. It was no more. You could wander down the pavement and not get your handbag smashed. Nonsense. Davao City is still the murder capital of the Philippines. The drug addiction is massive. In fact, in the first 10 days that Duterte was in power, 17,000 drug addicts surrendered in Davao City alone. So it sort of suggests that there might have been a little bit of a drug addiction problem there, which hadn't been solved by this sort of like zero tolerance regime he ran down there. So the whole lie that he told about Davao, people believed it. They said, "Oh, he's cleaned up this city, isn't that wonderful? He can do it for the Philippines." So that was one lie. Then once he was in power, he started lying. First lie was about his target. In this politics of fear and anxiety, the drug addicts. Okay, so in the February that he came in, he was voted in May 2016, and he started in June 2016 as president. That February, the Dangerous Drugs Board of the Philippines determined that there were 1.8 million drug users in the Philippines. Of them, most smoked cannabis occasionally, and fewer than half had a toke of ice or shabu, as they call it there, methamphetamine, within the past year. When Duterte started telling people how serious the drugs problem was, first of all, he described it as a drugs pandemic. He said that he started off as 3 million. Then it went to 4 million. Within 2 months of his being president, it was 4 to 5 million. And when Reuters, news agency, started contesting the statistics and calling them exaggerated, inflated, and sometimes non-existent, the Malacanang Palace called Reuters' reportage malicious and referred them to the Philippine National Police. Meanwhile, his own head of the Dangerous Drugs Board, who was in this invidious position where he was required to defend the ludicrous claims of the president, but couldn't because his own department had come up with figures which were a tiny fraction of what the president was saying was the problem. He was fired. In fact, Duterte fired him Trumpian style. He said, "You're fired," and just got rid of him like that in a public meeting. And so, but the trouble was the lies were repeated so often. Again, in common with Trump, the lies were repeated so often that people believed them.
So the central claim that drugs posed an existential threat to the Philippines was always nonsense.
Per capita, there are far more methamphetamine addicts in Australia than there are in the Philippines. There are 3 times as many guns in Australia as there are in the Philippines, per capita. You know, most countries could just deal with this. But what Duterte did is he set loose his death squads, his vigilante killers, most of whom were cops, and just gunned them down the streets.
And what about you and Duterte? I mean, you've eyeballed him, he's insulted you, you asked difficult questions, now you've written a book about him. Well, do you have a bit of a boy crush on him?
Look, he's great copy, I've got to say. As a journalist, you know, you're always drawn to somebody who's good copy. And Duterte, a bit like Trump, never fails to disappoint. I will tell you that. But when you know, he actually refused. His people refused to allow me to do an interview. Although he, in several conversations I had with him, willingly agreed to be interviewed by me. But he eventually said, "Look, you have to talk to my people." And unfortunately, his people really hated me a lot, so they didn't allow me to have an interview. But in the news conferences, that's where you can talk to him. And yeah, I had 2 particularly big run-ins, which happened in very late night news conferences down in Davao City. You know, he'd swagger into these things like 3 hours late, and they'd start at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you'd have to listen to him droning on for a couple of hours. And and I was the only foreign correspondent present on both of these occasions, and the Philippine press corps travelling with the president, and then the local press corps start asking questions, and they're normally quite polite, and I don't blame them for being polite, because if you ask the wrong sort of question, Duterte comes down on you like a ton of bricks, and I you know, we've seen how Duterte has really clamped down on the media, and you know, he's vicious. So there is a sort of thing with a foreign correspondent who can go into a country and feels that, okay, I can leave. So the Philippine journalist can't, and so therefore there's a responsibility that goes with that. But when you ask him about issues that he feels sensitive about, like his human rights record and the drugs war and the death squads and the killings, he goes nuts. And on one occasion, he put me up there with the Pope and Obama by calling me a son of a whore, live on TV. And it then went out on YouTube and got sort of 17 million hits. And the next day, everybody in the Philippines knew who I was. I was the bloke who asked the question and was called the son of a whore. And everyone wanted my picture taken with their picture taken with me. And everyone tried to get me to do the Duterte clenched fist salute. It's basically like doing that in the Philippines. Do that, and it shows you're a supporter of Duterte. Everybody tried to get me doing a clenched fist salute with Duterte. I never fell for it, fortunately, because it would have been my downfall. But there are a lot of people who have done. Like there was a visiting intelligence expert.
That's on video, by the way, isn't it? It's an easy still frame. You just done
yeah. Oh
shit. So I mean, so part of you does sort of, you're drawn to it, aren't you? I mean, clearly, because you see what people like in it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I won't deny that he's an absolutely intriguing character, and you know, I read you that psychological profile, and anybody who's got that sort of jumble of contradictions about him, who's got that sort of dangerous sort of like verge of psychopath personality, who's got the history. I mean, when I started digging into him, I discovered that actually not an awful lot of people knew that much about him. Like when a journalist goes to a country to report about something, the first thing you want to do, and I see colleagues in here in the audience, I mean, you want to research. You want to research this guy, and I've got a reputation as over-researching things. I pore over documents and newspaper cuttings. So I really know my stuff, but with the Philippines, it was actually quite hard to do that because there wasn't that much about Duterte. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because when you bring it all together, it's a frightening anthology of just, quite extraordinary history. And when you look into what he did in over those 20 years in Davao, and it's all sort of buried in US embassy cables, some of which were on WikiLeaks, and there was a human rights report in 2009, and there were a few articles here and a few articles there. Put them all together and go and meet the people who were involved, and then piece it all together, and it is like doing a jigsaw puzzle, and it all came together. So the one thing I would say is that this guy is described as many things, sort of mercurial, narcissistic, whatever, but he's also described quite often as unpredictable. In fact, I would have to say that my wonderful publisher, Scribe, has written this lovely little bit on the back of the book in which they say the first biography of Rodrigo Duterte, the murderous, unpredictable